Welcome everybody to this very special and first in-person session of The Shelves. And for those who are new to the series, The Shelves is a series of presentation of CUP volumes that is organized by the group Filosofia Antica Torino with the support of Cambridge University Press. This is a very special situation because we have stolen actually one of the sessions from our reading groups that we usually host in Turin. And we are in the library of the philosophy department in Turin with our students too, who are attending the session. Of course, I'm chairing the session, but I am in the presence of other people from our group. Before introducing you, Lars, you're going to be the last to be introduced. So Laura Marongiu, Federico Petrucci, and then we have Giacomo De Andres, who's attending online, and whom I wanted to thank in particular because he has had the burden, he took on him the burden of organizing all the events, especially those that are going to be taking place in March and April, which we will advertise soon. So thank you, Giacomo, on behalf of all of us. Okay, so it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Raresh, whose book we are presenting today. So I've met Raresh a few years ago, more than a few years ago now, but maybe let's keep it casual. So a few years ago in Leuven, he is now Humboldt postdoctoral fellow at Leuven and also postdoctoral fellow at Toronto University in the Department of Classics. He works on a variety of topics. His expertise ranges from Plato to Aristotle's metaphysics and Neoplatonism. He's now in the process, I won't mention his publication, just a work in progress. His book, he's under contract, yes. He has a Cambridge element under contract about the arguments for the existence of God after Aristotle. Okay, so this is future work. But today we are presenting Proclus on Aristotle, on Plato, a case study on motion, which is his book, recently published in 2025, which stems from the work that he has undertaken during his PhD. So, the session today is going to be a casual conversation with myself, Laura Marongiu, and Federico Petrucci, and Raresh, of course. I hope, exactly. So I am going to start to get the ball rolling. And I will start with a very a curiosity question. Mm-hmm. Just like every superhero and evil hero, your book is going to have an origin story. So I wanted to ask you, was there ever a particular passage or something that triggered your interest and made you think, okay, I'm going to write a book on Proclus, about Proclus, on Aristotle, on Plato, on motion?
Yeah, well, I think there were many such moments, but I would say a very important moment was while I was doing Aristotle, I was looking at the later reception, and I came across Proclus. I had been reading Proclus also before, and I was particularly struck by how critical Proclus was towards Aristotle, and how some of that was discussed in scholarship, and some of it hadn't been discussed yet in scholarship. And I saw specifically that Proclus engages with Aristotle's critical attitude towards Plato, so not just with Aristotle in general, but that there's a dialectic between Plato and Aristotle going on. Proclus engages with that and has a much more critical view of Aristotle than other Neoplatonists usually do. And there was one text specifically, I would say, and that was Plato's Laws 10, the 10th book of the Laws.
Your obsession, I can say.
Yes, exactly. I got quite obsessed with that. And then I saw that, Proclus also has something to say to that. And actually, Aristotle also criticizes that. He doesn't just criticize Phaedrus and other well-known works where Plato talks about motion and the origin of motion, but also specifically that one. And I think that led me down this path. And yeah, okay. Then various other things happened, but that's sort of how it started out.
Okay. But also, before we start and get into some more details of your book, another thing, is that your book starts with a very bold statement.
Right.
You say that about what is usually called the doctrine of symphonia between Plato and Aristotle, and you say it is questionable whether Proclus upheld the doctrine of a symphonia between Plato and Aristotle in the first place. And you say, in fact, one aim of this book is to deny this supposition. So a very bold statement. Can you please tell us also, so that people in the room can be on the same page, if you can introduce the doctrine a little bit, what it meant in late antiquity, and what like the different approaches were in Athens and Alexandria also?
Yeah, so late antique philosophy is characterized by the authorities of Plato and Aristotle, and as is widely known, most philosophers of late antiquity are Platonists. Their main allegiance is towards Plato, but interestingly enough, Aristotle at the same time becomes a massive authority for them. And as is well known, Aristotle often criticizes Plato. He seems to differ in a lot of doctrines. So the question is, how do we get along? What do we do with this difference between the two? What do we do with this conflict? If we still think that Aristotle is a great philosopher, maybe not as great as Plato, Platonists would think. Well, it depends. Yeah, maybe the opposite.
Why did you need to say that?
No. Maybe the opposite, but that's what these Platonists at least think. And anyway, and so they have to come up with some story. And Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, the founder of late antique Platonism, is quite critical of Aristotle. But as Neoplatonism becomes more institutionalized and the curriculum is being established, where Aristotle is an essential part before the study of Plato, a certain view becomes very current, and that's this idea that there's an essential harmony between the two. Now, this view finds different expressions, of course. It's not a unified perspective, and it's dogmatic, and you find 10 statements and everyone agrees with that. Of course not. But many Neoplatonists, at least, have this hunch that there is an essential harmony, and if Aristotle seems to disagree with Plato, this disagreement needs to be loosened, and we need to find the common ground there. And they do that primarily through their exegetical works. So you read Aristotle, you write commentaries on Aristotle, and wherever you think there's a disagreement, you try to lessen this disagreement. What happens then a bit later on in antiquity, so as we move on to figures like Proclus and his teacher Cyrenaeus, that's in the 5th century. We're talking here about the 5th century, so 200-300 years after Plotinus, 200 years after Plotinus, is that they suddenly become more critical of Aristotle. And one aims of this book was to figure out why do these people, and Proclus specifically, become more critical of Aristotle. And does this mean that they think, or Proclus specifically thinks, that there is no such harmony between Plato and Aristotle? And I think what I try to show in this book is that Proclus very much goes against this claim, and I picked out certain topics where I think he thinks there's a clear disagreement between Plato and Aristotle. They all center around the question of motion, and Proclus at times is very explicit that there is this disagreement. And we can compare his statements very well with the statements of other Neoplatonists, and they will tell you the opposite, right? They will tell you, no, there's still an agreement here. Proclus will say no.
Okay. Okay, I can jump in perhaps precisely on this topic. Yeah. So you show very well, I think also very convincingly, that while several Neoplatonists, most notably Simplicius, are fans of this symphonia, while Proclus' attitude is more nuanced, and this is shown by the fact that it's rather polemical towards Aristotle. And you speak in particular of a fascinating mixture of appreciation and rejection of Aristotelian ideas. And this sounds very convincing in my view. In this respect, I would ask, how does Proclus' approach differ from Cyrianus? Because Cyrianus as well tends to be rather polemical, rather critical towards Aristotle. So is there perhaps a difference in strategy or in tones? It's very difficult to assess, I know, because Cyrianus could not so much.
Exactly,
but have some ideas about it.
Yeah, I think what we would have to do there is find a topic where we find statements of both of these people, so both of Cyrenus and of Proclus, and then compare it. And we do have this question of the causality of the unmoved mover, the intellect, and there's the question there about what type of causality the unmoved mover has. The unmoved mover is supposed to cause the motion of the universe, ultimately at least, according to Aristotle, and this idea is then picked up by the Neoplatonists and is brought together with whatever Plato says. Okay, and the question there is, how does it exert this causality? And there's a common view that it's a final cause, so something desires the unmoved mover and therefore this motion is being brought about, or there's this view that it's an efficient cause. And Proclus explicitly tells us that it is not an efficient cause, it is just a final cause. Thinks we can find certain arguments in Aristotle to make it a final cause, but Aristotle is not saying that. We can reconstruct it, but Aristotle is not saying it. And therefore he's in disagreement with Plato. According to Plato, the unmoved mover, what they take to be the unmoved mover, the unmoved intellect, is both a final and an efficient cause. Okay, that's a long way to say that Cyrenus, we have some statements by Cyrenus on this issue, and they not just go in the same direction, but they use the same strategy. So Cyrenus, or very similar strategy, and Cyrenus is telling us, yes, according to Aristotle, it's just the final cause, but whether Aristotle wants to or not, we find these arguments in Aristotle, and based on these arguments, we can make his unmoved mover an efficient cause. So we can sort of force Aristotle into harmony with Plato on this issue. And what's interesting is that Cyrenus still seems to have this goal. We can force him to make him agree with Plato, whether he wanted to or not. Proclus has a similar approach, but he doesn't emphasize that ultimately they would agree. So he seems very, very happy with the conclusion. Yeah, maybe there is something there. He has these arguments, but I don't care if he actually would agree with Plato on this. So Proclus stops a bit earlier. Okay, how many or what general conclusion can we draw from this? I don't know, because there's so little material in Cyrenus. That's a problem. I think their attitudes must be very similar. That's what I would say. And similar in their criticism.
Yeah. Perfect. So similar strategies, but he perhaps, as in the test case, perhaps Proclus goes even further.
Yes, perhaps he goes even further, as far as we can say based on the material.
Yeah, on this. Okay, on this you say in various parts of the book that Proclus genuinely thinks that Aristotle misunderstood Plato. Genuinely thinks that he misunderstood Plato.
Yes.
So, okay, we can allow a little degree of psychologism here, but then I would ask you, how would you characterize Proclus' own approach to Aristotle? So would you say that his primary aim is exegetical, so he's really trying to reconstruct, he's generally interested in reconstructing Plato's authentic doctrine, or in a systematic way, or is he using Aristotle in such a way, or is Aristotle a stimulus for developing his own Platonic answers? Where would you stand here?
Yeah, I think that Proclus has a genuine interest in Aristotle. He thinks we have to study Aristotle and give our best to understand him, but we should be aware that Aristotle has certain limitations. Aristotle lacks this theological perspective on the study of philosophy. So he's very well for studying very good at studying natural philosophy, but we should be very careful when Aristotle makes certain statements about causes that transcend the natural realm, that is, immaterial things like the unmoved mover, the intellect, and what he says about that. His conclusions, even about these causes, have some value, right? In the sense that there is an unmoved mover, it is relevant for the functioning of the cosmos. But if you want to know exactly about this causality question we just talked about, you should study Plato and you should bring in Plato. Some conclusions, of course, strike us as quite weird. We would think, this idea that Proclus has there about Plato is derived from Aristotle. Clearly, he got it from Aristotle. And Proclus would deny that, right? Proclus would say, no, you find this already in Plato. So this question can be answered from two perspectives, from Proclus's perspective and from our perspective. our perspective would say, yeah, he has it from Aristotle. He studied a lot of Aristotle and whoever else taught him in Athens, right? Or whatever he read. And they got it from Aristotle. But to Proclus, this wasn't clear anymore. Also because of all this exegetical background, because of the authority of Plato. And then if you talk about the unmoved mover, for instance, you would just say, no, you find it in Plato. You find references to the intellect. Intellect is clearly superior to the world soul. And clearly it must play some role in causing motion and causing the cosmos. And it's like an unmoved mover in Aristotle. Right, so that's what Proclus would tell you.
Yeah, so the bottom line is Aristotle is a tool. The framework of the answers should be a Platonic one. I mean, if
yes, absolutely, yeah,
okay.
yeah. Tool. Yeah, tool. if it's studied properly.
Okay, it can also be.
If it's studied properly and
Okay, not
with an awareness to its limitations. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good bottom line then.
And if I mean, this leads us to the problem of, well, I'm now more on Plato, so I read your pages thinking about how much Proclus, read in this way, may contribute to our reading of Plato.
Yes.
And here, there's something striking for me, since it concerns the two perversions I have, Timaeus and Middle Platonism, is you may read this narrative as a sort of developmentalist narrative, writing to Proclus, since it is correctly your goal. And then, for instance, when you read your remarks on Middle Platonists, it looks like you are sort of dismissive.
Yeah.
So these weird people really thought that our soul had locomotion.
Yes.
And then the serious Neoplatonists. And it's fine. But I agree.
Yes.
But on the other hand, nowadays we may or not agree with this position, but nowadays there is a strand of people supporting the view that the motion of the soul in Plato as such is local motion. You don't agree with this.
Yes.
But still there is this
yes, of course.
So my point is whether our interest in reading these arguments and also Proclus' use of Aristotle in reading Plato, what's the import of this for our understanding of Plato as such?
Yeah.
Whether there is and of this interest, we may also understand this point as being about Proclus. Or not.
I think one thing that is very interesting is to see what relevance Aristotle's criticism has. So Proclus and many other Neoplatonists, and sometimes I compare them with the Middle Platonists, they take Aristotle's criticism very serious. And there is a tendency nowadays in scholarship to interpret Plato in a certain way that is not aware of Aristotle's criticism. Now, of course, you might think that, well, that's simply Plato's opinion. I don't care that Aristotle criticizes it later. But I think taking into considerations Aristotle's testimonies and his criticism might help us to have a more nuanced view also on Plato. And I think another view is, that might sound crazy, and that's a lot of an issue with people that study a lot of Neoplatonists, maybe, is you see obviously Plato with different eyes, and you wonder if certain things that the Neoplatonists are saying, like Proclus, whether it's really so far-fetched and it's not actually there in the text. And an issue, for instance, that I and also other people have been exploring is, for instance, this origin of motion. So, according to Plato, usually the prime mover is the soul, the self-moved soul. And then Proclus obviously thinks otherwise than the Neoplatonists. They think, no, there's this intellect, and the intelligible sphere plays an important role. And once you bring that back to Plato, and then you wonder, wait a minute, Aristotle also tells us that...
this is a showdown.
Okay. Aristotle also tells us that the forms play an important role. And surely he didn't quite, out of nothing, invent that there is an unmoved mover, right? And that there's a separate intellect. Let's look again at what he says in Laws 10 and the Phaedrus and oh, there's an intellect there as well, and there's a motion question. you know what I'm talking about. So you always have to be careful to not become, you know, so entrenched with Neoplatonist thinking that whatever you read about Plato is tied to that. But I think it opens up new avenues there.
Another question.
Yes, well, on this issue of what is Platonic really or not, Proclus claimed that the unmoved mover is fundamentally Platonic. You just mentioned this a little bit. For us, of course, it might sound like, as we were saying, as a surprising claim, at least first. But as you were saying, maybe there are some reasons why this might be the case. So do you want to get into, do you want to give us some more details as to what is the strategy that Proclus adopts?
I think that's a good case, because as you said, prima facie, on the first view, it seems to be clearly of Aristotelian provenience. I think one important strategy for Proclus is to figure out, and this obviously has a lot of Neoplatonist background, is to figure out what this thing is that is above the soul, what lies above the psychic substance. And he thinks that's obviously the intelligible realm, like Plato said, and more specifically that there is this intellect. Now, there's a question as to the relation of intellect and intelligible realm. The Neoplatonists commonly bring the two together. And they find that, where do you find, of course, the intellect? Well, you find him in the Philebus, in the Timaeus. And if you want to look at the context where motion is specifically mentioned, it's in Laws 10. So once you get the idea that, oh, there's this thing, intellect, it's separate from the soul, it must have some connection with the soul. Then you look at Laws 10, and it says that the intellect has a specific motion, and the world soul, depending on whether it participates in intellect or not, guides the cosmos in a certain way, right? Either orderly, if it participates in the intellect, and nous, and reason, or disorderly if it doesn't participate in that. So then you might as well try to spell out, okay, what exactly is this relationship? It participates in intellect or not? Well, then you read a bit of Aristotle, and then right, but you kind of see where this could go. Of course, it's not straightforward at all. But you might wonder whether there is not a connection there in regards to motion. If you already accept that there is a separate intellect, there is a world soul, the world soul causes the motion of the universe. What about the import of the intellect on the world soul causing this motion? That's like sketched out how it how they think that they find it in Plato.
Okay, that's.
So now that you mentioned motion,
finally.
So first a curiosity and then a question. So I was just curious to hear, what was your starting point when you started your PhD or to write this book? Was it motion? Was it Proclus? Or was it more generally Neoplatonist attitudes toward Aristotle and Plato? And why did you choose precisely motion? And the related question would be, do you think that this case study, that the conclusion you've drawn with respect to motion, are also applicable to ethics, to metaphysics? Perhaps we could also answer, we don't know, but perhaps motion is specifically a particularly telling case in point to explore this dynamic.
I think one starting point was definitely trying to figure out what Proclus's relationship and view on Aristotle was, and then I was trying to see, okay, what's a topic that Proclus addresses a lot, Aristotle addresses a lot, and ideally is also a major issue of contention between Plato and Aristotle. And it seemed like kinesis is great for that, because it is a major issue of difference between Plato and Aristotle as to its very essence, and as to what things have kinesis, motion, and as to the origin of it, right? There are disagreement on all of these fronts, apparent disagreements. And then Proclus has written a lot on that, and he's written specifically also on Aristotle, this small booklet, The Elements of Physics, which is not super exciting, but it's a great place to start because he deals there with Aristotle's physics and his De Caelo. So I would say that's sort of what my strategy was and why I then settled for kinesis. Another issue would be obviously it has a lot of not just physical but also metaphysical consequences. And as to the conclusions that I draw from it, yes, they focus, of course, primarily on natural philosophy, physics, what they would call physics, and metaphysics. As to ethics, well, there's this never-ending issue to what degree they were interested in Aristotle's ethics. So if you look at the curriculum, Aristotle's ethics was apparently studied, but we know very little, and we have very little evidence that they actually did study Aristotle's ethics. So ideally, they studied it. To what degree were they influenced? I mean, just one example, right? If we take ethics. So I think that the general conclusions would apply, but you would have to find like a topic where you find a lot of material and you can nicely compare the different perspectives.
Okay, I want to get a little bit more into Proclus' own account. So Proclus introduces a triad of hierarchy of movers, and then you have the soul mover, the self mover as an intermediate term, right? We've said a little bit about the unmoved mover. So can you tell us something more about his understanding and of the movers, about his classification, and what kind of problem this triad solves that neither Plato nor Aristotle could address on their own?
Yeah, I don't know if I would make the case that Proclus solves something that the others do not solve. Well, I think in his eyes, in his eyes, I think how he sees it, and this is very Neo-Platonist, Neo-Platonic again, is that there's a sensible realm and there's the intelligible realm, and they believe that there has to be something intermediate that mediates between these two realms. I don't want to say that instantiates the forms. The forms certainly are already instantiated, but there has to be a principle that takes care, has some form of providential care, one aspect at least, over the universe. And for that, someone like Proclus posits the world soul. That would be one perspective, more cosmological one. A more metaphysical one would be that the difference is quite high. Big difference between the intelligible realm, the realm of the forms, and the sensible realm. And the Neoplatonists have this idea that reality proceeds from the one in all sorts of intermediary and in a mediated way. So what you want to avoid is sudden, big differences between different layers of reality. You want everything to be nicely mediated. And so they think that the soul, which on the one hand is located in this world, we are in soul, the cosmos is in soul. On the other hand, is not located in this world because it has the possibility of contemplating the forms and perhaps even does that. So I think these would be the two perspectives why they generally assume that there's something psychic. Now, as to its role specifically in motion, right?
If you can also give us some elements about how the distinctions of motions are kind of bridged. The ones that you can find in Aristotle or in Plato are kind of bridged in Proclus. So also to, if you can be also a bit more descriptive about how this happens.
I think one worry that Proclus has is he wants to maintain that souls have a certain autonomy and are able to start moving on their own. This, however, is connected to this other worry that souls cannot be the primary absolute starting point. For various metaphysical reasons, soul cannot be the first principle. So this is a problem. On the one hand, you want to maintain that souls have this autonomy and can move themselves in their own right. They're not like a body, which is completely dependent on external influences, right? But on the other hand, there must be something higher than soul for metaphysical reasons. And so Proclus is trying to square these two views by maintaining the autonomy of the soul, saying, no, it has like this major causal input, but still this causal input is informed by the forms. Now, as to how successful this is, I try to argue that it's quite successful. Go there to some details, but this is basically the issue and how Proclus would want to solve it. Yeah.
Okay. Also, perhaps another question on Proclus' theory of motion. So you distinguish very clearly between this physical motion and non-physical, so not spiritual but non-physical motion. This is also well done, I think. And the question would be, where would we place Aristotle? Of course, in the background of physical motion, but could we also retrace some hints or some kind of reappropriation also in the higher layers of non-physical, perhaps tacitly and implicitly?
Yeah.
Or perhaps not.
No, I do think so. I mean, there's a very common story that goes something like this. Plato thinks that the soul is self-moved. It's debatable what that exactly means. Aristotle is not happy with attributing motion to something like the soul and to the intellect. So therefore, he comes up with a term like energeia, and generally tries to be a bit more clear about what the activity of the soul is and what the activity of the intellect is. The Neoplatonists are clearly aware of that. And partly that's exactly what they would tell you. Well, what Aristotle calls energeia, we just happen to call motion. Plato just has this tendency of calling things in this way. It's just a matter of preference, how you would say. I think Proclus specifically would not be very happy with that. Well, because he's not trying to be this hyper harmonist, quite the opposite. And in this respect, he would say, no, it's important to call it motion, to call it kinesis, because that creates a kinship between the different activities. And it shows you what activity is derived from what. So Proclus has this Platonic insight that if you find some phenomenon in this sensible realm, it must be derived from a higher phenomenon, and ultimately it must be derived from a form of the phenomenon X. So if you find motion here, ultimately it has to be derived from the form of motion, and this goes for different layers because the Neoplatonists have this layered metaphysics. So I think that's why for him it would be quite important. No, we need to keep the same term kinesis and establish this causal relationship that derives from, well, ultimately the one, but definitely on the level of the intelligible realm. You find the form of motion, and then all different other types of motions, soul, self-motion, and so on. Which of course leaves you then open to the accusation that this is some type of homonymy and you're using terms in widely different ways. And this is a charge that would go back to Aristotle ultimately, right? So you could say, well, we come back to the Aristotelian criticism. Well, Proclus would tell you, well, I at least have this causal story, and I'm not just saying bank and bank, and one is a bank to sit on, the other is the bank to put your money in. But clearly, there's a causal relationship between the two, and at least that holds them together as activities.
So, in the book, you also give us a lot of details about Proclus' philosophical method. So, especially in the first chapter, how it selects arguments for specific audiences or in specific, in particular, in the elements of physics and the elements of theology, how they're organized and how. Although he tends, or we might look at some omissions as something that he didn't want to discuss. Sometimes he has reasons for these omissions and this sort of stuff. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about that, and also if there is something distinctive about his method in the way he reads and constructs these philosophical systems.
I think the Neoplatonists and Proclus answer for Proclus, there's clearly a pedagogical context to whatever is going on here. So they're writing commentaries. These commentaries are tied, or Proclus is writing commentaries. These commentaries are tied to more or less specific situation of teaching these texts in a classroom setting. And So depending on how advanced the students are, and depending on where the text is in the curriculum, whether this is, more like an undergraduate text or a graduate text, right? You can go more into details. And since Aristotle is in the lower half of the curriculum, right? You can't go into certain metaphysical details because the students are not prepared for it. So if you look at a work like the Elements of Physics, just quite puzzling, right? So the Elements of Physics is written, as I said, it's a summary of Aristotle's physics and the Kylo, and it's written in this axiomatic method that you find in Euclid. And what it tries to show you is give an overview of important theorems that you find in Aristotle on kinesis, on motion, and it ultimately culminates in this idea that there is an unmoved mover. So there's a clear aim there. How does this fit then into the curriculum, right? Why does he approach it in this way there? And clearly one reason is for the student who has studied or maybe not studied very well Aristotle's physics or De Kylo to quickly look into it, see the different theorems. You can see pretty clearly how one is derived from the other and how, okay, that's how Aristotle, gets to the idea that there is an unmoved mover that is indivisible and ultimately is in charge of the motion of the universe. What you will find lacking there, for instance, are references to self-motion or references to ether, which, according to Aristotle, moves in a circular way and seems to do so autonomously. Self-motion, according to Aristotle, is different than the Platonic concept of self-motion. Again, Proclus leaves that out. Why does he leave out these things? Well, because they're better discussed in a slightly more advanced setting, also once you know what Plato thinks of them. These are issues where Aristotle clearly clashes with Plato, so we better discuss them somewhere else when people know more about them. And that's exactly what Proclus then does. I mean, when he discusses them in his commentary on the Timaeus. When Plato in the Timaeus says certain things, and then he can come in and say, look, Aristotle says something quite different here. This is not right because Plato tells us this. But then you have the dialogue in front of you, you can check, and you will not be seduced by Aristotelian mischaracterizations and misunderstandings and become a peripatetic, right? I mean, there's a clear ideology there.
He's aware.
He's aware that there is a danger and a risk. So they're seductive, yeah.
Yeah, but all of this pedagogical aims, it's kind of can be considered common to other authors. So I was wondering if there is.
But this is like a specific example,
Okay, I was wondering if there is something like particularly specific of
yes, okay, I should have clarified that. In this case, the specificity of Proclus is this axiomatic method that he uses.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this axiomatic method you find in this Elements of Physics and in the Elements of Theology. The Elements of Theology deal with Neoplatonist metaphysics. So they're more advanced than the Elements of Physics. They overlap. If you look at issues of motion, they slightly overlap. And you can see how there's much more import from Plato in the Elements of Theology than in the Elements of Physics, which is much more for beginner work. And that's not just due to the different setting in the curriculum, but that's also partly due to this axiomatic method that he employs, and that sets him apart from other Neoplatonists.
Okay.
And in a sense, I mean, a question could be, what is, in order to even to conceive this new method or approach,
yes,
but especially to apply it, what is, in your view, on the desk of Proclus? Since, well, there is this quarter, what did Proclus read?
Yes.
And so what were the main instruments Proclus used, in your view? First, on the peripatetic side, the obvious thing is, to what extent did he use or appreciate? But it's not just a question of having texts at disposal. The point is whether you're interested in having them. Alexander on the peripatetic side, to what extent he was interested, and the other point is the Platonist tradition, in the sense that, of course, well, he just cannibalized everything before, or almost everything before, so you never know whether you have Porphyry in Iamblichus, in Syrianus, in Proclus.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So What do you think about this? I mean,
Yeah,
what was on your desk?
Yeah. So I think it's clear that Proclus's work is quite derivative of earlier Neoplatonists that have already dealt with non-Platonist sources, be they peripatetic or something else. I think that it's not up for debate. I do think that if we look at these works, like the elements of physics, but especially the elements of theology, we do see that Proclus is quite original in these works. We can clearly establish that. And we can also do that if we look at something like the Platonic theology, which is also quite different than earlier attempts to systematize Plato's theology. It's much more vast in its scope, it's much more thorough in its exegesis, and it's much more well in depth as it goes through the layers of the metaphysical hierarchy. Anyway, as to your question, to what degree he was actually interested in these authors, peripatetics, for instance. There is a thorough engagement, for instance, on certain issues like ether. So he's very much inclined there to quote other peripatetic authors and to see, look, they have a different opinion on this. They explain ether in this way. This, in fact, is closer to our Platonist understanding of them. So he is inclined to do that there. He is also inclined to sometimes lump together Aristotle with other peripatetics. He might do that out of politeness, to say that Aristotle, has been distorted through the tradition, and this is now sort of the Aristotle as we understand him now. But maybe there's a possibility that, in fact, he said something else. But the peripatetics now claim X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's just a claim that you find, it's like a verbatim quote from Aristotle. So you don't know, is he just doing it out of politeness, or is he making some claim there? So I do think there are instances of serious engagement with the peripatetics, but also more superficial ones that as I just said, quotes them as opponents, and then I don't know if that.
No, of course, right,
yeah.
And another, well, perhaps it's along, or more or less along the same historical line or historical line, or historical line. You in the very first reply you gave, said at a certain point, Proclus changes. I mean, it proposes his own approach with respect to the harmonization, the harmony issue, and so we have many instances of harmonization and many uses of Aristotle. For instance, in a very curious case, which we were mentioning yesterday in the other reading group, is Philo of Alexandria, who says, look, the academics said that according to Plato, the world is sempiternal, and of course, people say that they are authoritative since they were students of Plato, but look, there is a very intelligent scholar, a student of Plato, who is Aristotle, who says that in Plato's view, the world was temporally generated. And then you find a twist, because he's saying at the same time that Aristotle was more intelligent than the others, but that Aristotle's own theory was wrong. So this is a way to appropriate of Aristotle. Then you find the Middle Platonist way, and so on and so forth. It seems to me that, especially up to Plotinus, I don't know whether it may be included or not in this strand, you have an agenda concerning the use of Aristotle. It is Stoicism. Paradoxical enough, I mean, Platonists have to challenge the Stoics. And Aristotle is the best instrument you can use to go against the Stoics. Then you have Plotinus, Porphyry, and so on, and the Stoics perhaps are not really there at that point, since the Platonism is already. And then so you have harmonization for different reasons, and then, so I take over what you said. At a certain point, Proclus breaks with the trend of harmonization.
Yes.
So there is anything in this move by Proclus that concerns these macro-historical reasons for having a certain attitude towards Aristotle, or it's just about Proclus' own perception of the best philosophical consistency of the system? And so on?
I think there might be different reasons. I would say I would just focus on two. So I think, again, it's something that has been mentioned more often, but we can see it specifically in the case of Proclus. So there's clearly, in the case of Proclus and perhaps other Athenian Neoplatonists, a massive interest in theology. And then this theology, of course, has to be Platonist theology. And then Aristotle simply is insufficient in reconstructing any type of Platonist theology, and very often clearly seems to go against what Plato said at about immaterial substances. Now, if your interest is more on natural philosophy, as seems to be the case, for instance, with Simplicius and other people in Alexandria, it's easier to find a harmony there. If your interest is more into theology and metaphysics, and you're writing a massive book like the Platonic Theology, and it's quite obvious to you that Aristotle doesn't say anything about the one. I mean, not just that he criticizes the forms and everything, but there is no one in Aristotle. Now, someone like Simplicius famously is forced to accept that there is the one also in Aristotle. So he has a quote that clearly, he mentions the word saphos there clearly, twice, that clearly Aristotle clearly mentioned that there is the one. And then he gives you this quote from this Aristotelian fragment, which has escaped me. We only have one which one is it? We have only one fragment left that it's either nous or something beyond nous. It's a very famous fragment. Anyway, so Simplicius is forced, right, to admit that even Aristotle has a one. But luckily, he doesn't say much about theology, so he can just drop it somewhere on the physics and then go back to the natural philosophical issues. Proclus doesn't have that, right? He wants to build the system of theology. He has to use a lot of Plato. Aristotle is still insufficient. So therefore, I need to rethink what my approach towards Aristotle is. Now, while I'm doing that, I'm also wondering, so I'm talking about the perspective of Proclus, right? While I'm doing that, I also become aware, not just of doctrinal differences, but I become aware that Aristotle says in his works, here I criticize Plato. A normal person understands then, oh, Aristotle criticizes Plato. Now, if you're Simplicius, you're forced to say, no, Aristotle does not say that he criticizes Plato there. What he says there is that he criticizes a wrong understanding of Plato. Now, this does not seem very likely to many people, right? So Proclus takes the more realistic, I would say, attitude, and that's, Aristotle is criticizing their Plato. He disagrees with him on theology. So how can I say that there is this essential harmony between the two? Yes, there's a harmony on many issues. Aristotle is super important, but clearly he's lacking in some respects. Yeah. So this might be like two reasons why.
Okay, if I don't know if there are any other very pressing questions. Otherwise, I might ask you the very last one.
Sure.
Okay, and it is a very important one.
Yes.
So after writing the book, where does your heart stand? With Plato, with Aristotle, or with Proclus on the notion of motion?
Yeah.
You need to
that's not an easy question. Well, look, I think
let's reveal the point. We are giving this course together.
Yeah.
And we are trying to.
We're competing.
Yeah. We are not competing. But
Aristotle and Plato are competing, of course. I mean,
they are competing.
We are making Aristotle and Plato compete. So we want to. I mean, obviously, you can have an easy way out. You could say Proclus, but that's an easy one.
I think I started actually the project out of a big appreciation of Aristotle. Mm-hmm. So maybe I started out with Aristotle. I moved to Plato and then to Proclus. And I would say that now, actually, after finishing the book and looking at certain texts by Proclus, I discovered, or I gained a higher appreciation of Proclus, a higher one than maybe I had before. And that's because I have studied Aristotle and Plato more, and I feel like, I not just feel, I mean, that's a weak word. I think that, some of his interpretations and what he's doing with these authors is not just fruitful, but is also close to some, very probable and very good interpretations of these texts. So.
Okay. Well, I mean, you chose the easy way out. Anyway. Okay,
that's wise.
Yes, exactly. A wise but easy way out. So we do have time for a couple of questions, if we want, either from here or from the chat.
From the chat, they signal the fragment we were talking about earlier.
Yes.
I don't know if you can see it.
No, we cannot see it. Read it out loud if it's not the problem.
Aristotle on prayer.
On prayer. Yes, on prayer.
In the Dialogue.
Yes, on prayer. Yeah.
Yes.
That's it.
Thank you.
One thing that I forgot to mention, and it's important, first is to thank also Michael Sharp for helping us setting this up. But also, this might be of interest to you, is that we have a 40% discount for the book for the people who have attended the presentation. So
online and in presence.
Yes, both online and in presence. So if you want to buy Raresh's book, you can send an email to Michael Sharp, and we will drop his address in the chat soon. Soon. I will do it now.
I don't know whether there is any question.
We have been too thorough.
Okay, if not, as Julia already said, this was just the first and sort of preview of our shared series of this year, and on our channels and on the main mailing list, we will advertise in due course the three further meetings which we are organizing for the spring.
I cannot, of course, I cannot drop it in the chat because I'm not connected from this computer. So you did right? No. So okay, I'm gonna send it to you and you can drop it.
I'll do it.
Okay.
You may close.
Okay, so well, you said that we're gonna advertise soon the next our next meetings, which are going to be in March, April. But then in due time you will see the advertisement. For the moment, I just want to thank Raresh again, but also Federico and Laura for being with us. I enjoyed reading your book very much.
Thanks a lot for inviting me to Turin.
No, but I wanted to say this was a big surprise. Like Proclus is not my favorite, Neoplaton
even
is
better.
not my favorite either. But still, I enjoyed the book, so I think that's the best review
Thank you
that I
for
could
reading.
give.
Yeah, thanks for engaging with it.
So thank you very much, and well,
Thanks a lot. Thank you.